Hello and welcome to CG Visuals. My name's Zach, and today we'll be taking a look at how to create this fully procedural wind simulation inside of Trapcode Particular using fluid dynamics. So we'll start in After Effects with a standard 1080p comp, and we've already got a new instance of Trapcode Particular loaded. But first we're going to create a null object and name it Position Reference. And we're going to go to the window here and select Motion Sketch. And this allows us to actually draw out an animation in the X and Y axis with our mouse in real time. And this is just a really quick way to get a placeholder animation that we can use to give us some feedback on how our particles are going to behave in motion. So after you've copied and pasted those position keyframes into Particular, you'll be able to see the particles inheriting the motion. So first we'll go to the emitter type and change that to an OBJ model, as we're going to need a volume for our fluids to interact with. We'll choose the smooth sphere, decrease the container size to 200, increase the particles to 2500 per second, and set the emitter behavior to emit from speed. They might be lasting a little bit too long, so we'll reduce the lifespan to 1 second with the randomness of 25. And now we'll go ahead and enable off our fluids. Now we have some values that we're going to put in here for the time being. That's force region size to 650, the random swirl to 0.5, the swirl scale to 500, the visualized density to opacity. We're also going to change the fluid force to a vortex ring, reduce the core size to 25, and then increase the fidelity to 10 and also the viscosity to 50, as these fluids are going to move very quickly. Now, as you can see, not much is happening, but once we increase the velocity from motion, we'll immediately be able to see how those settings interact with the potential velocity of 2500 and 800 there. And so now when we preview this, all of that velocity has to be resolved with the fluid simulation, and that's what gives us that nice swirl. We're going to change the emit from edges to faces. We're getting some nice large movements, but we're going to use this turbulent displacement to create some finer details. So we'll put the size to 15, the opacity to 5, the displacement to 100, fade in of 0, and the evolution speed to 250. So now we've layered two levels of turbulent displacement on top of each other. We're going to increase the particle size to 20, reduce the feather to 30, and then we're going to create a custom size over life graph. We've also got a little bit of randomness for the size as well. So we want these particles to gradually increase over time. As you can imagine, this is air, so we want the opacity to be quite low, 15, randomness of 75, and we want them to fade in and out as gradually as possible, as represented by the graph there. I'm just boosting the opacity a little bit so we can see this. So we're going to set the color over life, and if you want to know the exact color values I'm using here, you can simply copy the color code there, but it's basically a light sort of, basically I'm trying to sample the colors that you might associate with air, which is kind of like a dirt color, like a pale sort of sandy color. But of course air doesn't actually have a color. I think we could actually increase the particles a little bit further there to 3500. And so we can see something is starting to happen. We are going to open the designer very quickly. This is quite handy because we can actually draw a custom motion here, and the designer will preview that for us. We're actually going to create a new system. Now we want to make sure this system has environment settings and displacement settings so that they don't inherit those settings from the primary system. Now we're going to change that point emitter to emit from parent. Sometimes you can get a lot of particles very quickly. That's why I'm already, reducing the particles per second to 35 and the emission probability to only 5%. Going to get rid of all of the velocity and reduce the velocity from motion. We're going to also decide what settings we want for these particles as well, so I'm going for very similar, increasing them but decreasing the opacity with a lot of randomness, and we're also using a straight linear graph there to increase the size over life for the secondary particles, but we're actually going to copy the custom opacity over life from the primary system into this second system and just adjust that slightly because we already did some of that work. And then we'll also copy the color over life that we made from the primary system and simply choose color over life and paste that custom graph just to save us a few clicks. And very important to also reduce the lifespan there, otherwise we're going to have too many particles on screen. So we'll go into the environment settings, we'll reduce the air density to 0.5, going to increase the position to 250, reduce the scale to 5, the complexity to 1, and the evolution speed all the way up to 500. Trying to get this to behave like wind by using the environment settings. We do have some issues there which we'll be able to resolve a little bit later on. One thing I forgot to do was decide when our particles are going to emit from the primary system. So we only want them to really emit for the first 20% of the lifespan, not including the first frames because that's when the fluids are sometimes moving the fastest. So by doing this, it will reduce the number of particles that fly off by themselves. We're also going to enable the meandering system. We're going to increase the direction, the speed to 50, reduce the scale to 5 and the complexity to 1 and the evolution speed to 250. Those settings are giving us large, simple sort of displacement patterns. We'll also add a turbulent field as well with the size of 10, opacity of 5. We're reducing the scale to 3, the complexity to 1, the evolution to 500. Very similar settings that we used on the primary system. And I'm actually just going to hop back into the motion sketch and create a faster motion just so that we can kind of see what this simulation looks like in a different animation. And one thing we can do is increase the simulation samples per frame to 2, and that will actually allow the motion to sample more frames so we don't get oddities. I can actually adjust the random seed of the primary system just because I think that's looking a little bit odd as a still frame, but when we adjust that we can get a completely different result. One thing to remember is this will require some experimentation to get a nice aesthetic result. So we're going to also enhance this with a few effects, just a motion tile effect, some simple turbulent displacement just to try and make things a little bit more motiony, if that's even a word. And then we'll also add a very important vector blur, perpendicular, amount 100, map softness of 100, ridge smoothness of 3. And if we increase exposure, you can see this is really just kind of smoothing out the edges. And so we'll go ahead and render this as an asset, which needs to have an alpha channel there, so we'll choose the animation codec and simply save that as an asset. Now I did a little bit of experimentation off screen and set up a more interesting animation than just having the wind move to one side, and I've already pre-rendered my custom version that I spent a little bit more time on. I kind of did something more like this, what you can see, but just refined it a little bit more, and so I ended up with something that kind of looks like an airbending sequence, you know. So we'll create a new composition, call it export comp, and just drag our particles comp into the export comp. And so now we can see, we'll bring in a custom background. I've chosen this nice desert environment, and so there are quite a lot of things we can do to improve this. The first thing we'll do is come to color correction, tritone, and we can just really quickly try to sample some of the colors in the scene. It doesn't have to be super accurate. We'll sort of adjust these a little bit anyway, and if we're lucky, this will just basically help us match the color tone of the environment. I'm also going to add this refine soft matte edges with the chatter reduction set to smoother and all of the checkboxes unchecked. And as you can see, that will just act as some sort of denoising. And I'm also going to come down to the Red Giant VFX Suite and choose the shadow effect. And this is the quickest way I found to add shadows. This is going to add quite a lot to the effect. So we're just using the widget there to match the light direction of our scene. Going to reduce the opacity, and we can also sample a color for the shadow as well, as shadows aren't 100% black. They do inherit colors from the sky. So now we can see we've got a nice shadow happening there. And then we're going to create an adjustment layer, come to Effect, Stylize, Motion Tile. Whenever I use a motion tile, that's to resolve issues that can happen around the edges, like when adding a displacement map. So I'm going to set that to -25 and 15, make sure it's using the particles comp layer as the alpha matte. And we're also going to set the track matte to use the alpha of the particles comp as well. And so then we'll just duplicate our particles comp layer, delete all of the effects except of the tritone, and we're going to use a compound blur to try and create like a hazy effect, almost as if there's more dust being collected in the atmosphere, and we can change that blending mode to something like soft light or hard light. And I just think there's kind of an interesting look that seems to improve things. And then one more final thing we can do is come to Time, Pixel, Motion Blur, pop that on a new adjustment layer, and that'll just sort of blur the background behind the air if it moves fast enough. I'm also going to add some basic Lumetri color correction just to add a vignette around the outside and boost the contrast a little bit. Just makes the image a little bit nicer on the eyes, and we can see the before and after here of all of our compositing. And so now we can preview this effect in full screen and really appreciate all of the effects coming together, like the shadows and the color correction and the fluid simulation. And this tutorial was actually inspired by one of the airbending projects in our Trapcode Elements pack, specifically this air manipulation project. So this was a slightly more simplified version of that effect, and there are many other projects that allow you to create advanced particle simulations. And we'll be creating more tutorials inspired by these projects in the future so that you can learn how to create these effects for yourself. So we'll wrap things up there for now. Stay tuned for next time, and thanks for watching.